to the whole Bible series. This week we are in the book of Isaiah. Yeshayahu is part of the prophets in the Tanakh. In our Bible, Isaiah is part of the Old Testament prophets. The book of Isaiah covers almost exclusively the prophecies of the prophet Isaiah. There's little in the way of context for the prophecies and almost nothing about Isaiah himself. For more information about the prophetic books, go back to episode 27. Isaiah is the 23rd book of the Bible. Who wrote Isaiah and when? Hebrew tradition holds that Isaiah was written by the prophet Isaiah. The beginning of the book identifies the prophetic material with Isaiah, the son of Amos, but it does not identify him as the author. The prophecies are dated to the reigns of Uzziah or Azariah through Hezekiah and during the life of Isaiah. This gives us a rough date of approximately 740 to 700 BC. There are issues, however, with the dating of the book composition. While Isaiah chapters 1 through 39 seem like a solid unit, chapters 40 through 66 are disconnected in both historical references and speech. For this reason, many scholars refer to 2nd Isaiah 40 through 55 and 3rd Isaiah 56 through 66, assuming them to be written by later prophets. Hill and Walton are not convinced of the separate authorship theory, instead attributing these differences to the different settings of the prophecies, Ahaz, Hezekiah, the exile and post-exile, and to accurate prophecy, like the naming of Cyrus, the later king of Babylon, or Persia, I should say. Some of these issues may also be understood by seeing a later editor or editors that tried to clarify the prophetic oracles of Isaiah for the reader. Again, for more information, go back to episode 27. Some of the themes in Isaiah are Isaiah's sons' names as signs, servant, Holy One of Israel, Redeemer, and eschatology. Regarding eschatology, how much prophecy versus eschatology is here in the book? So eschatology is the study of end times, including death, the intermediate state, the afterlife, judgment, the millennium, heaven, and hell. It also refers to the time of Jesus' second coming. The word eschatology comes from a combination of Greek words, meaning the study of last things. Here's a quote from the Survey of the Old Testament. The eschatology, the study of the conclusion of God's agenda found in the book of Isaiah, is a kingdom eschatology. By that, we mean that the emphasis is on the future kingdom of Israel. It is depicted as a kingdom centered in Jerusalem. Peace and prosperity will abound, and all the world will come to Jerusalem and marvel and be taught. Proper worship and the centrality of the law are significant characteristics of this kingdom. A descendant of Jesse will be on the throne, but this aspect of the kingdom is not prominent in Isaiah. The emphasis is on the fact that Yahweh will reign and will be the pride of the remnant of Judah and the glory of Jerusalem. For this reason, there being only a little eschatology in the book of Isaiah, we rate eschatology in the book 1 out of 4 horsemen. The survey of Isaiah is here. We have 5 separate sections. The dating of Isaiah here is on the timeline, so you can see the books that we've gone through already in the past, the historical books of the Old Testament, and where Isaiah sits. So it sits firmly in the middle of both 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. Again, from about 740 to 700 BC. The kings during Isaiah's time stretch from Azariah or Uzziah all the way to Manasseh. So we see Isaiah 1:1, the vision that Isaiah saw, the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Manasseh is not mentioned in here because he spends little time with him before his death. Let's get into the first section. the introduction to chapter 1 through 6. So we just read verse 1, the vision of Isaiah the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah or Azariah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Excuse me. So we have some sections within the introduction. First, chapter 1 is the confronting of the sins of Judah, then the guilt and hope of Judah, and then the condemning of the sins of Judah in chapter 5. There's a quote here from Survey the Old Testament. There has been considerable dispute over the natures of chapters 1 through 5, since the formal commissioning of Isaiah is related in chapter 6. Some have contended that 1 through 5 contain oracles from before the time of the vision that Isaiah had in the year Uzziah died. Others believe that those 5 chapters serve as an introduction to the book by gathering selected oracles from many different periods of Isaiah's ministry. Whether or not this material was editorially gathered or preserves early material, it does serve as a suitable introduction to the book and its themes. Chapter 6 should be seen as a conclusion to this introduction, for it suggests that the people were not going to pay attention to Isaiah's message. Isaiah unheeded preaching would stand as a confirmation of the guilt of Israel established by the indictments of 1 through 5 and would lead to their eventual destruction. So let's break down chapter 6. Chapter 6, verse 1. So we're starting here off in approximately 740 BC. In the year that Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord, Yahweh of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. So let's stop there and look at a couple notes. So first, a note from the Bible Knowledge Commentary. 3 things struck Isaiah about God in his vision. He was seated on a throne, he was high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. So let's look at what each of those means. So first, he was seated. All right. Oftentimes in the ancient world, when one is seated in a vision or even in a court setting, that person is seated in judgment of others. So here, God sits in judgment. He is also exalted, showing that God is higher than all and has authority over all. And lastly, his robe, his glory cannot be contained into the most holy place where the ark is, but rather the robe fills the entire temple. And verse 3 makes it clear that his glory is throughout the whole earth. Then we come to a note about the use of holy being used 3 times. So holy, holy, holy. The reason that this is used is because 3 is the perfect number for the Hebrew people. And therefore, the seraphim are calling Yahweh the perfection of holiness. So they say, holy, 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 perfectly holy is Yahweh of hosts. And lastly, I want to talk about the seraphim. So many people assume that the seraphim are angels. Well, yes, they belong in the angelic categories. These are angelic creatures created by God, but seraphim gives us more information. So let's look here. Seraphim is the plural form of seraph in Hebrew, and this comes from the Dictionary of Deities and Demons. Seraphim, or literally burning ones, like cherubim, are throne guardians. So these are angels, but they're actually more specific than that. They're throne guardians. They're a different type of angels. And these are actually the only angels in the Bible that are ever seen or spoken of to have wings. All right, so the throne guardians, called the seraphim, are conceived as winged serpents, with certain human attributes. Instead of protecting Yahweh, the seraphim need their wings to cover themselves from head to feet from Yahweh's consuming holiness. Yahweh does not need their protection. Isaiah thus uses the seraphim to underscore the supreme holiness of the God on the throne. Now, just an interesting note, you see two descriptions here of the seraphim. One of them being burning ones, or one that is consumed by fire, and the other is of a winged serpent. Well, if we think back to the Garden of Eden, there's also another one who is seen as a serpent and who is described in certain passages as the bright one or the burning one. All right, so that may take your thoughts back to the enemy in the garden, who later becomes known as Satan. Let's continue. Verse 4. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, Yahweh of hosts, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, behold, this has touched your lips, your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. So two notes in this section. So first, recalling the areas highlighted in red, the Bible Knowledge Commentary says this: as the seraphs cried out, Isaiah saw the temple shake, and then it was filled with smoke. The thresholds were large foundation stones on which the doorposts stood. The shaking suggested that the awesome presence and power of God. The smoke was probably the cloud of glory, which Isaiah's ancestors had seen in the wilderness, and which the priests in Solomon's day had viewed in the dedicated temple. And then to the blue section, the words highlighted in blue. Isaiah had pronounced woes or threats of judgment on the nation, but now, by saying woe to me, he realized that he was the subject of judgment. This was because he was unclean. When seen next to the purity of God's holiness, the impurity of human sin is all the more evident. The prophet's unclean lips probably symbolized his attitudes and actions as well as his words, for a person's words reflect this thinking, or his thinking, and relate to his actions. Interestingly, Isaiah identified with his people, who were also sinful, a people of unclean lips. On to verse 8. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And I said, here I am, send me. And he said, go and say to this people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull, and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. Then I said, how long, O Lord? And he said, until cities lie waste with inhabitant, and houses without people, and the land is a desolate waste, and the Lord removes people far away, and the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. And though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump. So again, two notes over here to the left. So let's look first at the blue section. So the blue box to the left, talking about holy, 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 calling back to the Lord of hosts. Yahweh is the Lord of hosts. What are these hosts? And here in verse 8, it says, who will go for us? So who is God, Yahweh? Who is he speaking to in these two sections? Who are these hosts that he is saying us? The Unseen Realm, Michael Heiser says this: it is important not to miss the wording of Isaiah 6:8. Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? So Yahweh is sending, but the person that he's sending is going in place of his counsel. The participatory nature of God's rule with his counsel is evident again. So the Lord of hosts is God amongst his counsel. And so when Yahweh says, who will go for us, he's speaking of the council itself. Go down here to the bottom where we have the word holy. Expositor's Bible Commentary makes this note. How astounding that God should use the word holy, or kodesh, of the remnant of his people, when this word has already been used in verse 3 in relation to his own transcendent being. This is condescending grace indeed. So pointing out really that God has been described by the word holy, perfectly holy, in fact, and that he would respond to his people and make his own people holy as well. This is a grace that is not deserving of sinful humans. Let's move on to the second section. So some of the elements within this section are grace through judgment for Judah, grace through judgment for Israel, the enjoyment of God's grace. Then there's a first series of oracles, the here and now. Oracles against Babylon, Philistia, Moab, the Syria-Israel alliance, and Egypt. Then we come to a second series of oracles, the deeper truth, about Babylon, Edom, Arabia, Jerusalem, and Tyre. And then a third series of oracles, the final end, where Isaiah speaks of the wasted city, the fact that the Lord will punish, that he will swallow up death forever, that he will ordain peace, and the whole world will be fruitful. Let me just note here, you see the little asterisk there, during the reign of Ahaz. This is the time period where Assyria conquers northern Israel, the kingdom of Israel, and this happens about 722 BC. So this happens in the midst of Isaiah's prophetic career. And then a little note from the Survey of the Old Testament about this section. The first historical scenario of the book attaches it to the reign of Ahaz, beginning in about 735 BC and extending over the next several years. The purpose of chapters 7 through 12 is to highlight the failure of Ahaz to trust Yahweh and the results of that failure. These are mostly oracles of judgment, but are interspersed with glimpses of future hope. The point is to show that while Ahaz's failure was serious, it would not annul the covenant. God still intended to bring the promised kingdom after the period of judgment was over. The oracles against the nations, chapters 13 through 23, are properly placed here as a demonstration of God's sovereign control over all the nations. The fact that Damascus and Israel were going to be unsuccessful in their attempted overthrow of the Davidic line, and the fact that Assyria successfully invaded the West, are neither incidental nor isolated. Israel was to trust Yahweh because he was in control over all that transpired politically and in any other realm. These oracles were not given for the sake of the nations whom they concern. Rather, through these oracles, Israel was given a sense of the transcendent power of God. Chapter 24 through 27 conclude this segment by speaking generally of the deliverance of Israel and the destruction of her enemies. We then come to the third section of Isaiah. So in this section, there's oracles during the reign of Hezekiah. So we moved on from Ahaz to Hezekiah. And this goes like this: 6 laments with assurances. First, the proud crown of Ephraim, the city where David encamped, those who turn things upside down, stubborn children with their own plans, those who go down to Egypt for help, the destroyer who has not been judged, and 2 final outcomes: judgment or salvation. Survey of the Old Testament says this about this section: The woe oracles of chapters 28 through 33 shift the focus to the second scenario in the time of Hezekiah. In the last decade and a half of the 8th century BC, Jerusalem was in a potential distress, chapter 29, and Hezekiah was making alliances with Egypt, 30 through 31. These oracles are filled with the indictment for the nation's failure to trust Yahweh. Chapter 33 speaks of deliverance for the righteous ones in Zion, while chapters 34 and 35 speak of the wrath and judgment of Yahweh to fall on all his enemies. The end of the Assyrian crisis, 36 through 37, came when Hezekiah called on Yahweh to overthrow the armies of Sennacherib. It is interesting that the writer used the Assyrian office to summarize the significant theological points. In his speech to Hezekiah's envoys, Rabshakeh insisted that the Egyptians would not be of any help to Israel. This parallels the idea that the Israelites were not to put their trust in Egypt. Rabshakeh made reference to Hezekiah's reforms, which he portrayed as making God angry, though the reader knows that they brought God's favor, and then presented the challenge that no other gods had been able to withstand the Assyrian armies. This heightened the irony of the situation because the subsequent act of God's deliverance stands as a testimony to the unique power of the God of Israel. And here, regarding this account, we can see parallel accounts in 2 Kings 19 and 20 and 2 Chronicles 26 and 32. We then finish up this third section with practical trust in God vindicated and human inconstancy sent into exile. Chapters 38 and 39 function as a transition from the Assyrian crisis to the Babylonian crisis, scenario 2 to scenario 3. Hezekiah's miraculous recovery from mortal illness came in response to his prayer and confirmed his standing as a godly king. But word of that recovery prompted Merodach-Baladan, the king of Babylon, to send envoys to Hezekiah with personal congratulations. Hezekiah took the liberty to show them the royal treasury. All this provided for the backdrop for the oracle of Isaiah 39, 6 through 7, which indicated that the Babylonians would be the ones to carry Judah into exile. This oracle sets up the scene for a major literary and thematic shift that occurs with chapter 40. And so we come to the end of chapter 39, verse 5 through 7. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming, when all that is in your house and all that your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord, and some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." And then we come to the fourth section, the oracles for the exiles. So here, Isaiah's prophesying to a future time of exile. And he goes through these sections. The glory of God, his coming exclusivity and power. The one true God moving history for his people. False hopes, the Lord's servant, a new song. God reclaims his people for his glory. God revives his people for his glory. God predicts his use of Cyrus. The gods and pride of Babylon doomed. God will free his people from Babylon for his own sake. The Lord's servant displayed, his people assured. The Lord's servant taught, his people attentive. Encouragements to a responsive faith. The Lord's servant, this exalted sin bearer. Compassion for God's people offered to all. So for the Old Testament says, the crisis related in scenario 3, chapters 40 through 55, was the Babylonian exile spoken of in 39, 6 through 7. If we accept this as the prophecy of Isaiah, son of Amoz, in the 8th century, we should note that he was not prophesying about the exile. Rather, he was assuming it and addressing his message to those who were part of it, which would come over 100 years later. Was this intended to have meaning to Isaiah's 8th century audience? Yes, for two reasons. Number one, its emphasis was not to establish trust in the sovereignty of God. Exiled did not come, or excuse me, the exile did not come because of any divine inability to deliver, whether God delivered, as in the destruction of Sennacherib's army, or not, as in the fall of Jerusalem later in 586 BC. His sovereign plan was being carried out and everything was under his control. And then, two, in keeping with the purpose of most aftermath oracles, the people of Isaiah's time needed to be reassured that God would not fail to carry out his promises. After the period of judgment, God would bring restoration. This confidence and hope put the threat of punishment in a larger perspective. I also want to take some messianic gleaning from Isaiah, because there's something there that later gets taken on as an understanding of a future Messiah. So again, the survey of the Old Testament says, the themes of chapters 40 through 55 include the coming deliverance of the exiles, the worthlessness of idols, the coming judgment on the nations, and God's use of a particular servant as an instrument to carry out his plan. All this was directed towards the political and spiritual restoration of Israel. Throughout this section of the book, the recurrent challenge is issued for the idols and pagan gods to reveal a plan for history, to show how it was followed in the past and how it would be carried out in the future. The extension of Yahweh's plan from the past into the future is presented as a prima facie, or first view, evidence of his sovereignty and uniqueness. Real quick, prima facie is a Latin expression meaning on its first encounter or at first sight. So the literal translation would be at first face or at first appearance, from the feminine forms of primus and facies, both in the ablative case. In modern colloquial and conversational English, a common translation would be on the face of it. The term prima facie is used in modern legal English, including both civil law and criminal law, to signify that upon initial examination, sufficient corroborating evidence appears to exist to support a case. In common law jurisdiction, prima facie denotes evidence that, unless rebutted, would be sufficient to prove a particular proposition or fact. So in other words, on the face of it, the evidence is supportive of God's sovereignty and uniqueness, and there is no evidence to go against that. The Expositor's Bible Commentary says this: who then is the servant? The Christian, guided by the use made of the servant songs in the New Testament, is likely to immediately say Jesus. Certainly, there's not a word of the songs that cannot be applied to him, even when the servant is called Israel. For as Matthew clearly saw, Jesus was the perfect expression of what God intended Israel to be. Jewish interpreters have identified the servant with Israel as a nation, the faithful remnant, ideal Israel, and various historical characters, including the prophet himself and Jeremiah. So I don't want to get too deep into this, into the Messiah aspect, because I want to focus on the Old Testament now, and we'll look back at the Old Testament when we get to the New Testament, but just know that this is there. And then finally, the oracles for the post-exilic. In this section, we have the true people of God redefined, the false people of God exposed, the true people of God invited, the path to blessing, ritual versus responsibility, present failure, eternal covenant, future glory, the anointed preacher renewing the world, the coming victor, his past faithfulness, praying for the power of God, the eagerness of God for his people's eternal joy, and true worship now and forever. Survey of the Old Testament says this: finally, in scenario 4, chapters 56 through 66 project even further into the future to address those who have returned from exile. So this is 520 BC and later. Upright living, the future glory of Jerusalem, and God's vengeance on his enemies are common topics. In all this, Yahweh laid out before Israel his agenda so that the people might understand and affirm his holiness, sovereignty, and faithfulness. A promised exile and restoration. So that we come to the end of Isaiah. Here, Isaiah has laid out for the people of Judah oracles of both destruction, restitution, and ultimately the victory of Yahweh and his people Israel. During the exilic and post-exilic, the Second Temple period, the Jews would look to Isaiah and to the other prophets as God's promise to bring deliverance through a physical agent, the anointed descendant of David. This anointed one is pictured as the Messiah, who would lead Israel out from under the thumb of the nations and bring military victory and a new kingdom, one in which Israel would be at the top of all nations alongside God's Davidic king. So just note here to the left, defining what the Second Temple period is. That's the time from the rebuilding of the Second Temple in approximately 516 BC, all the way to when it is destroyed in AD 70. So we then come to outside, we finished the book of Isaiah, but I wanted to give you a little bit more information that could be available to us from other sources. We come to the king Manasseh, who's the son of Hezekiah. Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abomination of the nations from who the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. And he burned his sons as an offering in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and used fortune telling and omens and sorcery, and dealt with mediums and with necromancers. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Manasseh led Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem astray to do more evil than the nations from whom the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. So that gives us a little sense of how bad a guy Manasseh is. And so Manasseh comes on the scene, and now Isaiah has to deal with this guy. So while we don't have any more biblical information about Isaiah's, the end of Isaiah's life and his death, a Jewish tradition holds information on both his life and death that are included in two pseudepigraphic books, as well as the Talmud. And his death may be referred to by the author of Hebrews. So actually, let's start first with the Talmud. So what is the Talmud? The Talmud is a collection of rabbinic Jewish texts that record the oral tradition of the early rabbis. So this is the teaching of the rabbis that came from the biblical text. So they would take the biblical text, they would read it, they would pass on oral tradition, they would put their own teaching in there, and that got eventually recorded into the Talmud into the first century and beyond. The Talmud is a primary source for the study of Judaism from the 1st century AD up to the date of its final redaction as late as the 7th century. The Talmud is likewise relevant to the study of Judaism in Jesus's and the apostles' lifetimes. So that comes from the Lexham Bible Dictionary. So just note, as we go through these other two pseudepigraphic books and the information that's in there, that the Talmud, they back up this information that we're going to get. Okay, so let's look first at the book, The Ascension of Isaiah. Also known as the Martyrdom and Ascension of Isaiah, and sometimes appearing as two distinct works, The Ascension and Martyrdom of Isaiah. A 1st to 2nd century AD non-canonical and pseudonymous work that claims to narrate Isaiah's death by Manasseh's hand and Isaiah's vision of the triune God. Though generally considered non-canonical, this work is included in some Ethiopian Bibles, but is not regarded as canonical by any other Christian traditions. The first half of the work concludes with Manasseh's arrest of Isaiah. Isaiah persists in his condemnations and then is sawed in half with a wooden saw. We also have information from the book, The Lives of the Prophets. a Jewish writing from the 1st century AD concerned with the biblical prophets' historical origins, miraculous works, and places of burial. This text can be viewed as a parabiblical or rewritten Bible and is classified among the pseudepigrapha. The book includes brief accounts of the major biblical prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, the 12 minor prophets, Hosea, Micah, Amos, Joel, Obadiah, Jonah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, and other prophets listed in the historical books. The author declares the book's purpose in the first words of the work, the names of the prophets, and where they are from, and where they died, and how and where they lie. So here in this book also, there's also the same information that Isaiah was eventually shoved in a tree and sawed in half by a wooden saw. So getting to the author of Hebrews, he makes this comment. So he's speaking of the Old Testament prophets, and the writer of Hebrews says this: others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, and they were killed with the sword. So this is speaking of what the Hebrew people, what the Jews did to the prophets of Yahweh. And so this is all the information that we have on the end of Isaiah, of the end of his life. And so you can take that with a grain of salt, but there is some evidence for this actually taking place, even though it's not written in the Bible. So that's it. That's the book of Isaiah. If you have any questions, we'd love to hear them and to respond and to engage with you. Thank you for your time, and have a great evening.